When I review televisions on this channel, I don't just rely on high-end equipment to objectively measure and calibrate their colors. I also evaluate their picture quality subjectively against a state-of-the-art reference monitor, namely the Sony BVM-HX3110, which is capable of reaching 4000 nits on the 10% window and sustaining 1000 nits full screen. At over £30,000, it's the most expensive piece of kit I've ever purchased for the channel. Money that could have gone towards hiring a full-time cameraman to replace Vinny, who is frankly useless. Now, I'm not telling you this to brag about how empty my bank account looks after buying the HX3110, but rather to give you some context when I say this. I have found my favorite TV of 2025, the one that comes closest to reproducing the creator's intent, especially in HDR content, and that's the Panasonic Z95B OLED. It uses the latest generation 4-stack WOLED panel, marketed by supplier LG Display as primary RGB tandem OLED. Thanks to improved luminous efficiency, HDR peak brightness measured nearly 2400 nits on a 10% window after calibration to D65 white point, and over 300 nits full fill, which makes the Panasonic Z95B one of the brightest OLED TVs available to buy this year, allowing it to provide a closer match to the Sony HX3110 reference monitor, particularly when rendering high-nit HDR content. Beyond these headline figures, there are a couple of noteworthy changes under the hood that set the Z95B apart, not only from rival OLEDs on the market, but also from Panasonic's previous models. 1. It's the first TV I've reviewed so far that limits its maximum HDR light output according to the ST2086 Max CLL metadata embedded in the HDR10 video signal, with the minimum floor of 1000 nits. To explain, if the Max CLL metadata reads 1500 nits, the Z95B's measured peak brightness will be capped at 1500 nits, subject to typical panel variants. If Max CLL is 1000 nits, the peak brightness will likewise be limited to 1000 nits. But if the Max CLL is 4000 nits, the TV will output the full luminance it's capable of, between 2300 and 2400 nits, with a gradual roll-off to preserve specular highlight detail in HDR10 content mastered to 4000 nits. In theory, this implementation is quite clever. By respecting the Max CLL ceiling, it can help maintain RGB purity for longer and delay the onset of white subpixel boosting, especially pertinent given HDR10's absolute PQ system. After all, there's little benefit in outputting more than 1000 nits if the content itself was only graded up to 1000 nits. However, when watching HDR content in a bright room, which, for the record, I strongly disapprove of, a higher light output is clearly required. This likely explains Panasonic's second change of setting the default HDR luminance level to 70 instead of the usual maximum value of 100. HDR luminance level 70 is designed to track the PQ curve while leaving ample headroom for increased peak brightness at the expense of PQ EOTF accuracy. Due to panel-to-panel variation, our 55-inch review unit actually tracked a touch brighter than reference at the default HDR luminance level of 70, lowering it to 69, a rather memorable number by all accounts. Brought EOTF tracking back in line with the PQ standard, so this control can certainly be a useful adjustment tool to quickly compensate for a panel that's slightly brighter or dimmer from factory. Otherwise, Panasonic offers the most granular control over coming out of black we have seen in the user menus across various OLED brands today, letting users adjust luminance and RGB balance down to 0.5% video stimulus. On our 55-inch review unit, this allowed us to dial in the PQ EOTF tracking just above black, helping the Panasonic Z95B come closer to matching a Sony HX3110 mastering monitor during low light sequences. Panasonic chose not to implement the diagonal dithering algorithm developed by WOLED panel supplier LG Display on last year's Z95A. But this year, they have had a change of heart, perhaps influenced by the results of our 2024 TV shootout, making the Z95B more effective than its predecessor at suppressing near-black chrominance overshoot artifacts. That said, up close, you may notice very fine diagonal lines in darker parts of a moving image, or even when turning or tilting your head quickly. However, from a normal TV viewing distance of at least several feet away, this should be a non-issue, since this is the surface area on our 55-inch Panasonic Z95B review unit from which the close-up footage showing the diagonal lines was captured. Now, it's important to understand that like any algorithm, dithering isn't foolproof. The lower the bitrate of the source material, the more likely you will see flashing artifacts from unintended activation of the white subpixels in dark scenes, artifacts that QD-OLED panels inherently avoid due to their lack of a white subpixel. Higher-end Panasonic OLEDs have long been praised for their accurate color tuning from factory, and the Z95B proudly continues this tradition. In the most accurate SDR filmmaker mode out of the box, our 55-inch review sample exhibited no grayscale inaccuracies exceeding the humanly perceptible threshold of delta error 3, and with just 2 clicks of RGB gain adjustment, we achieved very good result on this challenging color checker SG chart where 140 patches were measured. The TV also supports Kalman 3D LUT AutoCal, but the results were hit and miss in both SDR and HDR using the latest Kalman software and TV firmware available at the time of testing in July 2025, so we gave up after spending hours on a good few runs. Nevertheless, even out of the box, the Panasonic Z95B delivered a wonderfully cinematic and color-accurate image across a variety of SDR and HDR material we watched throughout our review period. Note that as with previous Panasonic OLEDs, the True Cinema mode adopts a slightly bluer alternate white point chosen by renowned colorist Stefan Sonnenfeld to match his reference monitor. However, we are not entirely convinced it aligns well with a dual-layer LCD mastering monitor. Our Z95B sample calibrated to D65 already appeared cooler than our Sony BVM-HX3110, also calibrated to D65. For HDR playback, DCI-P3 color gamut coverage reached almost 100% in UV terms, whereas Rec 2020 coverage came in at 83%, thanks to the purer spectral wavelengths produced by the new 4-stack WOLED panel. As a result, the Panasonic Z95B has significantly narrowed the gap in color luminance performance compared to QD-OLED, although in a handful of HDR titles containing inconsistent or anomalous metadata, brightly saturated colors may appear more muted on the Z95B, owing to its strict adherence to the ST2086 metadata specified in the HDR10 signal. In addition to baseline HDR10 and broadcast-friendly HLG, the Panasonic Z95B supports both HDR10+ and Dolby Vision dynamic metadata formats. However, we did encounter a couple of issues with Dolby Vision playback, whether from the built-in apps or external sources. First, there was more posterization in Dolby Vision mode compared to HDR10, as illustrated here on the title screen from the 4K Blu-ray of June, even though we only spotted this problem from time to time in real-world Dolby Vision content. Second, engaging motion smoothing while watching 24p Dolby Vision films would introduce intermittent frame skipping. This isn't easy to detect in a compressed YouTube video, so I've captured it in a slow motion footage where hopefully you will be able to spot the dropped frames more clearly. Otherwise, with the accurate IFC setting enabled by default from factory, the Panasonic Z95B correctly performed 5:5 pull-down to present slow panning shots in 24 frames per second movies accurately without telecinic judder. Although interestingly, even with accurate IFC disabled, the TV would still preserve proper 24p cadence from a 24 fps video source. The mild stutter inherent in 24p films wasn't apparent to our eyes on our 55-inch review sample. But if you are sensitive to this issue, which is laid bare by OLED's near instantaneous pixel response time, particularly on larger screen sizes, You can set intelligent frame creation to custom and film smooth to 1 or 2, which work well to reduce the 24p stutter without incurring significant soap opera effect or interpolation artifacts. For watching sports, we have no qualms enabling IFC or intelligent frame creation to boost motion resolution and reduce motion blur. Engaging the clear motion setting would activate 60Hz black frame insertion or BFI to improve motion clarity even further, and in SDR mode did not suffer from the usual brightness drop courtesy of inbuilt luminance compensation, though because we still witnessed some mild flicker in 50Hz sports broadcast, we preferred to turn BFI off. Now, with IFC motion interpolation active, we did occasionally notice frame skipping in certain 25p film broadcasts common in PAL regions including the UK, and even in 24p movies played through the internal apps, where certain titles may only be available in Dolby Vision, which tends to trip up IFC more frequently. If you keep seeing this issue in these instances, you might want to switch off IFC to restore artifact-free motion. When it came to upscaling sub-4K content, the Panasonic Z95B held its own against the excellent performance seen on the Sony BRAVIA 8 Mark II, bucking the trend of previous Panasonic OLEDs looking softer than the competition. Indeed, when we displayed a Luma zoom plate pattern in UHD SDR, some mild moire was present, suggesting that Panasonic has finally introduced a degree of microcontrast enhancement to sharpen the image, a technique Sony have employed over the past few years on their BRAVIA TVs, with LG and Samsung following suit. We did not notice any negative side effects in real-world content, but for purists who prefer an untempered picture, the pure direct setting can be engaged to disable this microcontrast processing, and the good news is that 5.5 pull-down appeared to remain functional in pure direct mode, so you won't experience telecinic judder during slow pans in 24p films, although motion interpolation is understandably disabled, which may be a consideration for those sensitive to the mild stutter inherent in 24p content. In terms of video interlacing, Jaggis suppression as well as 3.2 and 2.2 cadence detection were of high quality with no complaints from us. Powered by a MediaTek Pantonic 700 SoC, native 10-bit gradation on the Panasonic Z95B was excellent in HDR10 mode, manifesting less polarization than the Sony BRAVIA 8 Mark II in the skies of the Martian and other challenging scenes when displaying well-mastered material. To mitigate in-content polarization from heavily compressed, low bitrate sources, the Z95B's gradation smoothing decontouring filter proved marginally more effective than the implementation on last year's Z95A. There seemed to be a big jump going from gradation smoothing mid to max, leading to an overly filtered effect with significant blurring of fine detail, so we would advise against going higher than the mid setting for the best balance between smoothing and detail retention. Bright uniformity was very good on our 55-inch Panasonic Z95B review sample, with no visible banding or dirty screen effect on full-field gray slides. And even though the sides still appeared slightly pinker than the center, an expected characteristic of recent WOLED panels, overall color uniformity seemed to be better than what we observed on earlier generations of Panasonic flagship OLEDs equipped with MLA or macro lens array technology. Dark uniformity also ranked among the cleanest we've seen, with fewer thin vertical streaks than on previous non-4-stack WOLED TVs we've tested, bringing a noticeable improvement in panel consistency during near-black scenes. In both game and true game modes, input lag measured 12.7 milliseconds at 60 frames per second, which can be lowered even more to 8.9 milliseconds once you engage 60Hz refresh mode, which essentially performs frame doubling to 120 fps. With a true 120 fps video signal, input lag measured 4.5 milliseconds, making the Panasonic Z95B one of the most responsive TVs on the market for playing reflex-based games. Due to the use of a MediaTek Pantonic 700 chipset, only 2 out of 4 HDMI ports support the full HDMI 2.1 FRL bandwidth of 48 gigabits per second, of which one is the eARC port. The Z95B supports 4K 120Hz Dolby Vision gameplay from the Xbox Series X, But just like on all other Dolby Vision capable TVs we've tested, Dolby Vision game mode was still over-brightened relative to the PQ standard out of the box and was unable to maintain full 444 chroma reproduction at high refresh rates. As such, we recommend disabling Dolby Vision for gaming on the Xbox Series X and instead using HDR10 with source-based tone mapping correctly configured. Talking of which, HDRG support was well implemented in true game mode on the Panasonic Z95B, hard clipping at 2300 nits for both maximum tone matte luminance and maximum full-frame tone matte luminance to avoid subjecting compatible HDR games to unnecessary double tone mapping, thus preserving creative intent. VRR including NVIDIA G-Sync worked well to minimize frame drops and tearing artifacts, but just like on every OLED TV we have reviewed so far, some VRR flicker remain unavoidable in certain VRR games, particularly during more sedate scenes and on static menus. Even at 144Hz in HDR VRR, the Panasonic Z95B presented full UHD resolution, smooth gradation as demonstrated on this gray ramp pattern from the Display HDR app, as well as full 444 chroma reproduction with the Pure Direct option enabled. The otherwise useful game control board overlay remained quite sluggish to summon on our review unit, perhaps due to integration with the Fire TV OS, which thankfully was much snappier and intuitive to navigate. Although specific to the UK model, switching freely channels was excruciatingly slow even after disabling all data collection settings. I'm playing this clip in real time to show you how long it took from pressing the remote to the channel finally changing. At this rate, I might as well go put on the kettle. On a more positive note, the glossy anti-glare coating on the Z95B's WOLED panel helped retain deep blacks in the presence of ambient light, which together with the TV's high brightness output and relatively restrained logo detection auto-dimming algorithm, makes the Z95B a capable performer for daytime viewing in a bright room. In line with Panasonic's flagship OLEDs from recent years, the Z95B delivered a very good and immersive Dolby Atmos sound experience, aided by its array of front-firing, top-firing and side-firing speakers built directly into the chassis. However, there's no support for DTS audio decoding, and we noticed some bass rattling during the drum beats in the opening sequence of June, raising questions about whether this might be related to a reconfiguration of the woofer placement to accommodate the thermal flow aerodynamic cooling system. One potential solution, albeit not cost-free, would be to offload low-frequency reproduction to an external subwoofer, taking advantage of the subwoofer output port thoughtfully provided on the TV, almost as if Panasonic knew you are going to need it. Let's sum up the Z95B. Taking constructive feedback on the chin, Panasonic has clearly worked hard to address several shortcomings that held back its predecessor, the Z95A, in our TV shootout last year, and the result is nothing short of spectacular. HDR color luminance has been boosted thanks to the new 4-stack WOLED panel. Near black chrominance overshoot is now even more effectively managed, courtesy of LG Display's diagonal dithering algorithm, and upscaling has been sharpened through a touch of microcontrast enhancement, while still offering purists the option to switch it off via the Pure Direct mode. And it's the last point that underscores why I can't help but admire the precision and craftsmanship infused by Panasonic's engineers into the Z95B, like a sushi master meticulously preparing an omakase course. When you also factor in Panasonic's traditional strengths of outstanding color accuracy and exceptional shadow detailing, smooth native 10-bit gradation in HDR10, the innovative thermal flow cooling system to maximize panel brightness while keeping image retention at bay, the broadest HDR format support, low input lag with properly implemented HDRG in true game mode, as well as immersive built-in Dolby Atmos speakers, the Z95B earns our highly recommended Best-in-Class award, despite the occasional Dolby Vision posterization issue. Having tested the top-tier OLED models released so far this year from the 4 leading A brands, I would argue that the Panasonic Z95B currently stands as the most well-rounded in terms of overall picture quality, delivering a cleaner image and smoother gradation than the LG G5, more accurate colors and less glitchy 24p motion than the Samsung S95F, and higher brightness than the Sony BRAVIA 8 Mark II. Although, of course, the landscape may shift depending on future firmware updates rolled out by each brand to fix its respective flaws, perhaps in time for our 2025 TV shootout. If you are undecided about which OLED TV to buy, one place where you can get solid advice is at Richer Sounds, a trusted British AV retailer with more than 50 stores in the UK, who provides 6 years warranty on the vast majority of TVs if you join the company's VIP club. You will get the best deals through cheaper VIP exclusive install-only prices, complimentary gifts or freebies, so go visit your local Richer Sounds store or call telesales for your next TV purchase. Thanks again for your support. Okay, if you are considering the Panasonic Z95B, you might also be looking at the Sony BRAVIA 8 Mark II, another OLED that puts a strong emphasis on faithful reproduction of creative intent. To help you make up your mind, I've done a side-by-side comparison video you can watch by clicking here.